Welcome back to part 2 of our miniseries on lesbians and gays support the miners during the 1984-5 miners' strike. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first. LGSM was a broad church politically, but it was an effective organisation based around a couple of fundamental principles and practical goals, which we think something we can learn from for campaigns today. So Martin and then Brett, who are members of the group, explain more about how they worked.
So the group was formed on the basis, there was unanimous agreement for this, it was unconditional support for the miners against the government. Those of us that came together in the very early days of LGSM were absolutely clear this was what the group was to be about. It was absolutely unconditional support for the miners against the government. So we set up the group. We would have weekly meetings. One of the main aims was to go into the gay community and build support for the miners, and that from the very start involved being outside of venues as well as inside, collecting for the strike fund. We'd identified Dulais Valley, Dulais and Neath as the area that we would be supporting, and we made, unlike in the film, we did actually have some initial links with the area through a member of the Gay Young Socialist group, a person called Hugh Williams, was actually from Swansea, and he was a member of the Communist Party at the time and had contacts with the industrial organiser of the Communist Party, who put him in touch with the people in South Wales. I think at the time there were support groups all over the country, various support groups, very strong, lots of women's groups everywhere supporting the miners. It was quite a phenomenon how these groups were set up. So we had our own group, and from the off, we were supporting, raising money. We set up a bank account, and we got off to a really good start, and established the links fairly quickly. And we met with the people from Dulais and would arrange meetings in London, and that was it basically. So unconditional support, raising funds, and going into the lesbian and gay community to win over support, which obviously involved lots of discussion, debates, and argument with people that we would meet.
I mean, we, as Martin said, one of the first things we did was set up a bank account. We obviously wanted some way of ensuring that the money we collected was, accounted for, and that we had some means of sending it on to the mining community that we decided to support. I remember very clearly going into the Co-op Bank. The very first time we collected, we met on a Sunday as we'd all collected throughout the previous week, and taken this big holdall full of coins and notes, but really heavy, mainly coins, and I bagged it all up and plonked it on the counter at the Co-op Bank in Islington at the Angel. And I can just remember the look of slight surprise and bemusement on the face of the cashier behind the counter. I could see her reading this paying-in slip, lesbians and gays support the miners. There wasn't any particular hostility. It was just sort of, I could just kind of imagine what was going through this woman's mind. Gosh, what is this strange group? Who are these people? What are they doing? It all felt very exciting in a weird sort of way. One of the things, obviously, that we had to do when we first started meeting was, on a very practical level, was just agree, like a rota, if you like, of who was going to go out collecting, where they were going to collect, and what nights they were going to collect. One of the principal things we did was go out to the clubs and the bars and rattle our buckets and collect money. I remember on one occasion, again, I was standing outside the Bell pub at King's Cross. It was a very popular gay bar. And I was rattling my bucket, and I noticed coming out was Derek Jarman, the film director. He just dropped something into my bucket. It was a rolled-up note. I thought, oh, I wonder what that is. I thought it was a tenner. And in fact, it was a £50 note. And I'd never seen a £50 note before. It was just incredible. Then he just dropped it into the bucket. He walked away. He didn't want any kind of fuss or anything. I wanted to say thank you to him, but he just walked on his way, and I just thought that was an amazing act of generosity, something I will remember for a long time. It was very important that we did that. I mean, our primary purpose for coming together as a group was to, certainly in the initial stages, was to raise money to spread the message within the gay community. We weren't really about debating the more abstruse points, the rights and wrongs of the strike. We all agreed the strike was on, we supported the miners unconditionally, and really it was a case of all hands to the pumps. Let's collect what we can and make sure we send that money down to the mining communities who obviously desperately needed it.
Also, I think at that time, the way that the group operated was really, it's a fairly small group in the beginning. I think there's about not many more than about half a dozen of us originally, but it soon grew fairly rapidly. But because we all agreed on those principles, the initial principles of unconditional support, we did discuss politics from the off. There was no doubt about that, because every development in the strike was of great importance to us. So we followed it really, really clearly, and we had different perspectives. But when it came to the job of raising money, that was a priority. But the decision-making process was quite interesting, because it's very much, although there were people from very different political outlooks, and it was very much about consensus. So it was consensus. That was how decisions were made.
While many members of LGSM were socialists of one stripe or another, rather than organise in a sort of traditional hierarchical way or have a party-type structure with a central committee or whatever, they were highly democratic. Mike Jackson, who was secretary of the group, told us a bit more about this.
Yeah, I mean, LGSM didn't believe in leaders. We very deliberately had a very horizontal structure. We were a single issue campaign, so we didn't need a great big structure. We had two treasurers, though, because we were in the business of collecting funds for the miners, so obviously that was an important role. I was a secretary because obviously we needed a secretary, but the chair, for example, was a rotating chair. Each week we'd choose some victims of the chair the following week, whether they liked it or not.
As the group developed, that probably changed slightly, and there were some fairly fierce debates. But those debates were important debates, so I don't think there was a mistake in us openly discussing differences. But when it came down to it, most of the key members wouldn't tolerate people coming in and telling us how to do the job of supporting the miners unless they were actually out on the streets themselves doing the collection. So it's very much focused on, you come to the group, you go out, you do your collections. There was no real time for people that didn't pull their weight, basically. But the consensus thing was really good. It's the way that I quite like doing politics, really.
Yeah, I agree. I think the point I was really trying to make was that although, yes, we did have debates, we did discuss the politics of the strike, we didn't let that overshadow the primary purpose of the group, which was to collect money and to support the miners. We definitely didn't want to end up sort of becoming racked with factionalism and division. That would have been completely pointless. The strike was intense. It really was a case, as I said before, of all hands to the pumps. And we tried to make sure that we didn't lose sight of that fact. That was the real purpose of coming together and doing what we did in terms of collecting money.
I think also the meetings were, I suppose there were two groups in a way. There was the politicos, the people that were active politically before and during the strikes, and those who weren't. They wanted to support the strike. There was a big, the country was divided. It was a momentous strike. It was one of the biggest strikes in working class history. So there was a bit of tension, I suppose, because there was that political discussion, and we're all at different levels of understanding. So some of the discussions would have seemed quite unnecessary, I suppose, or a little bit obscure to some people. But it was a political education for absolutely everybody that participated in the group.
For those of you who are interested in the specific details of how the group organised, Mike explains more about this in a bonus audio to this episode, available for our Patreon supporters. Now, initially, LGSM activists got a pretty mixed reaction from London's gay community, but over time this changed.
Obviously, the responses that we got from within the lesbian and gay community varied. I would say, without doubt, the majority of people supported what we were doing. And I've got loads of stories that I can tell you there, especially lesbians and gay men putting money into our collecting buckets and just simply saying, my dad's a minor, my granddad was a minor, my brother's a minor. Yeah, there's this kind of artificial distinction between lesbians and gay men and minors or mining communities. And of course, that misses the point completely that a lot of us come from mining communities. I did. But we did get our hostilities. And one little trick I learned to do in that respect, bearing in mind that most of the people in LGSM were activists, full stop. So LGSM wasn't the only thing that they'd ever done in their life. Most people in LGSM were doing all kinds of stuff, like Mark and I, for example, working on Switchboard, and Mark was involved in half a dozen different things, including his tenants association, stuff like that. And the common one we got was, why are you collecting for the minors? You should be collecting for our community, bearing in mind that AIDS was just on the horizon then. And what I learned to do when I came across that challenge was say, before I answer that, mate, can you tell me what you do for the community? And I never met a single one of them who did jack shit for anybody. So the professional moaners, do you know what I mean? But not one of them said, I do this, I do that. Not a single one of them. So I never had to continue explaining myself to them. I just said, piss off. Yeah.
I think it's fair to say the response initially was mixed. There was definitely some hostility. There was initially definitely an awful lot of bemusement as to what we were doing, why we were supporting the minors, what were these people doing, standing outside a gay bar or a gay club collecting money. But I think the longer we were there and the more our presence became known and accepted, I think the more support there was for what we were doing. But I think it's fair to say that there was a degree of hostility throughout the whole of the strike. It wasn't like fierce, but yeah, it was something that was definitely there. It's clearly the case that not all gay people thought we were doing the right thing. It was very common to hear, what have the miners ever done for us? That was not an uncommon thing to hear. But we did experience overall throughout the course of the strike, I think ultimately a fairly high level of support, which was evidenced by the amount of money that we ended up collecting, which was, I think, all told, in terms of collections outside clubs and bars, and with the money that we raised through the Pits and Perverts concert that we put on at the Electric Ballroom in Camden in December '84, I think the total amount we raised was about £22,000, which was a pretty phenomenal amount of money at that time.
In response to being asked the question, what have the miners ever done for us? This is what Mark Ashton would say, as recounted in a short documentary about LGSM called All Out, Dancing and Delace.
Well, I mean, what do you mean when they said the miners don't support us? The miners dig coal, which creates fuel, which actually makes electricity. Would you go down and mine and work? I wouldn't like to go down and mine and work. One of the reasons I support miners a lot is because they go down and do it. I wouldn't do it.
I mean, there was a debate. It wasn't just outside or inside bars, clubs where we were collecting. There was also a debate taking place in the gay press, particularly Capital Gay, the newspaper at the time. So we were attacked in various columns by fairly prominent gay activists for what Brett said. What have the miners ever done for us? What's it got to do with us? We've got our own battles to fight. And there was always good ripostes from LGSM members who actually responded incredibly well. So that debate took place in the press. And I think overall the response that we got, particularly towards the end, was of the strike was reasonably positive. But as Brett said earlier, there was a lot going on around us. So in the trade union movement particularly, there, small gains were being made. People were campaigning against harassment, discrimination, and there's the famous customs raid on gays the word. So it was a very lively political situation. Things were developing, and the lesbian and gay community wasn't immune to that. Things were happening that were affecting us. So there was a far wider debate than just the miners' strike. I think people were seeing that the labour movement, that was where things were happening for lesbian and gay people. That was where the fight was taking place, and people were being defended, and there was solidarity being built.
I think for me, it was about trying to show to people that we're not isolated groups of people. We all have interconnections. We all ultimately, whether we realise it or appreciate it or not, we all ultimately all have the same aspirations. We all want to live happy, fulfilled lives. We want decent housing. We want decent jobs. We want to live our lives free from harassment. We want to be valued. We want dignity in our lives. And I think for me, it was about saying to people that we can't achieve equality as lesbian and gay people without the support of other people. We're a minority. We're always going to be a minority. We do depend and we do need other people to value and appreciate our struggle. We need their support. And the strike was an opportunity to show that solidarity is a vital element of winning any struggle. So I think it was about making links, about stressing the importance of solidarity, showing that actually we achieve far more together, and realising that we have a lot more in common with each other than we have in terms of differences. This is not always easy to get across to people, particularly when you're used to it. If you're lesbian or gay, you've grown up in an environment where you've probably faced intolerance, you've faced hostility. And let's face it, the miners and other particularly traditional industrial workers were not necessarily always known for their shall we say, their support for things like lesbian and gay rights. It was as much an education for them as anything else. But through that struggle, through that fight, through that coming together, when it was a case of all hands to the pumps, people's ability to appreciate and see things beyond their own immediate experience, I think, is an opportunity that has to be taken. And that, for me, was one of the important experiences of that strike.
Yeah, the key word was solidarity. Because we were a group of socialists, the idea that we wanted to put across was that our interests as an oppressed group, if you like, was to link up with other progressive organisations and movement, and that the working class movement was the key to making changes in society. So, but also I think so a lot of the original members, the founders of the group, came from working class backgrounds. So I think that really did inform the way that we were thinking, that sort of consciousness as well. Because you have to think during the 70s, early 80s was a time of, real militancy, and people did identify more than they do now. You could say you were working class, you were in a trade union. The trade union movement was much larger, and there were massive battles taking place. This wasn't the first miners' strike, and it wasn't actually the first time that gay men had supported a strike. That had happened before. So, yeah, in those general terms, it was allying ourselves and saying that if we want real change as lesbians and gay men, that we needed to be in a trade union, that we needed to get organised, that we needed to seek out allies. And I think that argument, that discussion that we would have had was actually also informed by the other groups at the same time, because there was LGSM, but there was numerous women's groups, black groups. There were all sorts of groups. I think the GLC played a massive part in facilitating that, giving people meeting spaces, just encouraging that kind of self-organisation, really, that kind of intersectional approach, as we would call it now. But I think for us, and because of the very nature of the group, it was about solidarity and seeing the working class as where change was going to happen, where it was going to come from.
Now, the GLC mentioned by Martin just then was the Greater London Council, which at the time was the leading local government body in Greater London, which was run by Labour, and which was later abolished by the Conservative government in 1986. A great moment depicted in the film Pride was the first visit by LGSM to the valleys. While the film is broadly accurate, the reality of that visit was a little different to how it was portrayed.
The film portrays that first trip as a group of about 8 or 9 people going down in a single minibus. In fact, there were about 27 of us, I think, who went down, and we took three vans in the end. That was an incredibly exciting time. There was a certain amount of, I don't know whether apprehension is the right word. We were excited to be going down to South Wales, but we were obviously slightly apprehensive about what kind of reception we would get and whether or not it would be a wholly positive experience. We all hoped and I think felt in our heart of hearts that it would be. And when we arrived quite late, actually. I think we did get lost. We arrived quite late. Quite a number of people did stay with Donovan in his house, as was shown in the film. But actually, most of us were billeted out with different miners' families. And the very next day when we met up, we were taken on a visit to one of the local pits. We met various of the miners and their families, their wives. We went in the evening to the Onllwyn Miners' Welfare Hall for a big party, a big get-together, and it was just fantastic. We didn't come across a single example of hostility, any unpleasantness, any uncomfortableness. The film, obviously for dramatic purposes, plays up the fact that there was some initial tension and hostility, but in fact we never experienced any of that at all. We found out subsequently from Sian James, who was one of the principal activists and who went on to become Labour MP. We found out from Sian that the support group, the organising committee in South Wales, they met, they knew that we were coming down, they'd sent us the invite in the first place. They'd made it clear to people that if anybody was uncomfortable or likely to be unwelcoming towards us when we came down, that those people better make sure they were pretty scarce, because they didn't want us to feel any uncomfortableness. And as I said, we went down, we didn't come across a single example of unpleasantness or any hostility. To the extent that there may have been some people who weren't happy about us coming down, I think Sian said subsequently the extremely small number of people, and we never saw them. So memory I'll treasure to the end of my days. Very quickly we got talking to miners, their families, their wives. We obviously shared drinks, stories, and before we knew it, we were all backslapping and exchanging anecdotes, and it was just great. It was a real treasured memory for me.
Ironically, nothing like how the movie projects it. There was no hostility from the outset. And in fact, by the end of that first weekend, we'd transformed from being political supporters of theirs to personal family friends. We'd been staying in their homes, we'd played with the kids, gone out for walks, etc. And then we had reciprocal kind of visits where we invited them to come and stay in our homes in London. So we became friends, not just political allies. Yeah, and that was profound. That very first time we went to Wales, although I've said to you how different Wales was to my Accrington background, how beautiful it was, how it was just one industry. Being in the Onllwyn Welfare Club was absolutely like being in one of the working men's clubs in Accrington, which I've been going to from the age of 17 or whatever. So for me, that wasn't at all alien. I was completely used to that. Whereas other people from the group, they'd not experienced that kind of thing at all. So literally, that by the end of that very first night on the Saturday night, for me, it just felt like being home. And it was a fantastic feeling that I just felt, wow, here I am. I'm out and proud as a gay man with my gay male friends and lesbian friends around me, and we're all out and we're all being accepted. Nobody give a shit about our sexuality. And that was brilliant. And indeed, there's some photographs unearthed themselves from that night. And, at the end of the night, Andy Den sat on Ray Goodspeed's lap, and they've got their arms around each other. They weren't lovers; they were just friends. But there's a minor couple in the background, a man and wife, and everything is just completely normal and acceptable. How cool is that? That's the ultimate aim, where actually nobody gives a damn about your sexuality, because it is just so, it's like having red hair. It doesn't matter. And that really was liberation, that. And that's why, for me, really, that one weekend transformed what was a gesture of political solidarity into what really became loving relationships. We were part of their families and they were part of our families, and you would do anything to defend them. And that takes class solidarity up to a completely different level.
Sian James and the other mining families experienced this coming together of two communities from the other side. A miner she mentions here, Di, is Di Donovan.
When they first came down, for me and for Martin and for our children, it was just like hosting any other group. But we were going to be learning about how life had affected them and why they felt this link with the miners. And then you start to learn that an awful lot of people are from a working class background. They belong to the same trade unions, not the NUM obviously, but those people who are in other trade unions, teachers, etc., working local authorities. So you actually started to see parallels, not the differences. And the film is described as a rom-com. And Matthew Warchus always says it's not about two lovers. It's about two communities who fell in love with each other. And that was the amazing thing, because suddenly the conversation was all about, what's your experience? What's led you to this? What's life like for you? And we'd been pretty, disinterested up at that point. There was nobody who was saying they were openly gay in our communities, but we all knew gay people. Nobody ever said, well, she's a lesbian or he's gay. It was just never spoken about. My father worked with two guys who were gay, and they had nicknames in the colliery, and I remember asking, why do they have these nicknames, Dad? And he said, they're a bit fruity. And there were all these euphemisms, but nobody was actually asking any questions. And I think if you didn't ask questions, you didn't get answers, and then it didn't put you on a confrontational front. So personally, we hadn't seen anybody being openly anti-gay or anti-lesbian, but equally, we haven't seen anybody or heard anybody being pro or openly admitting they were a gay or a man or a lesbian woman. And I think that was the thing that struck us, that we were pretty ashamed, really, that we hadn't asked these questions before. And it was those parallels that we saw that were amazing, because to hear about people's experiences, about why they'd had to leave their communities and go to cities like London to live their lives and their partnerships and their problems that they had faced. We had one particular friend, Roy, who had lost out on promotion several times in his job. And you're saying, well, what do you mean you haven't been promoted because you're gay? Well, once they find out that I'm gay, then you spoke to people who, were teachers who were saying, I daren't talk about being gay. Because if I talk about being gay, that may bring retribution down on me, or that might affect my future. Other people were openly gay, but that was the time and that was the period where being gay was something that if you didn't ask, you didn't get an answer, and then you wouldn't be on this confrontational front, or as we then learnt, maybe we hadn't asked the right questions at the right time. We hadn't had that opportunity in our family. So the first time I'd heard of LGSM was that night when the letter came. We then decided to send David and two other miners off, Ali Thomas and Tom Jones from Astragan Rice, off to meet them, and they made the contacts and the links. And as I said, the next stage then was inviting them down to our community to see where the money they'd raised for us was actually being spent. And that was an opportunity to show the community off. I can't say there was hostility. There wasn't any hostility. I can't say that people behaved themselves. I remember being in a pub one night with Derek and Henry, his partner, and there was this guy being pretty aggressive. And I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen here now? You know, how dare they behave like this? They embarrass our friends. I should give that so-and-so a piece of my mind. And then he came over and he'd had a bit to drink and he said, you're one of them, aren't you? You're one of them. I bristled up. And so Derek said, like, one of them what then? He said, one of them fucking teachers. Derek said, yes, I am a teacher. I remember thinking, what the hell has this got to do? And it turned out that this guy had had a really tough time with his teenage daughter in school, and she'd been excluded, and he was on a real downer on teachers. And it ended up with Derek giving him advice on what he should say to the headmaster about getting his daughter reinstated in school. And I remember thinking, oh, you know, but we'd assumed that he was being, you know, difficult because Derek was gay and there was nothing to do with it. But he was really on a downer, was with teachers. And somebody must have said at the bar, oh, Shannon Martin's mate from London, he's one of them gays, he's a teacher in London. And what he cottoned on to was the teacher bit. And so, you know, yeah, you did have misunderstandings, but other people in the community, like our older neighbours, would say, oh, they're lovely boys and girls, aren't they? Oh, when they come in next time, Sean, oh, they got lovely manners. Oh, they're so nice and they stop to have a chat with us. So, you know, people were being introduced to each other and learning about the community in very normal ways. You know, and I didn't mean to say that everything was hunky-dory. As my cousin saying, can't go up the Encloyne tonight. I said, why's that? I said, well, those gays are going to be there, aren't they? And I said, yes, what's that got to do with it? And I said, well, you know, will I be safe? And I said, what? Are you so bloody irresistible that somebody's going to grab you? You know, it was all of this, how they thought people wanted them to behave. And I remember one night somebody being rude to a couple of people, and it was all getting quite, you know, and it really, what you were seeing were young men who were quite interested and quite fascinated, and yet didn't want to show that interest and that fascination. You know, they wanted to be seen as macho young men. But once they got into conversations and people were starting to talk to each other, you saw the parallels. You didn't see the differences. You saw those things that made us similar and the things that made us similar, and we all had one massive thing in common. And we should never forget what that one thing we had in common was. We all hated Margaret Thatcher. And that brought us together like nothing else could, because we were communities that were under attack. So we were learning about how the BME community had been poorly treated, how the lesbian and gay community had been badly treated. And we were in that groupings now of it was okay, you know, for minors to be beaten up and to be poorly treated and their wives to be vilified and even to the behaviour of children in school. You know, it was affecting the children in school. Things like the local policeman's children telling my children that Father Christmas wasn't going to come to our house because Arthur Scargill, you know, would make their father come out on strike. Well, Roger and Rowena thought Arthur Scargill was right. You know, they'd met him on several occasions by this point. He'd always been very kind to them. You know, why so-and-so saying that Arthur Scargill is horrible and mean? So it was affecting all sections of the community, and kids were playing pickets and policemen on the schoolyard. It wasn't British Bulldogs, you know, Germans, Messerschmitts and British Spitfires. It was all about pickets and policemen. And we had things like our children, we had a Swiss journalist staying with us, and our children had gone out for the day, and my mother-in-law had taken them to a local agricultural fair. And when they came back full of the things they'd seen, and they were explaining to Alice that they'd been to an agricultural fair, and Alice said, what did you see? Oh, they'd seen this, they'd seen that, and they'd been in the fur and feather, and they'd seen all these rabbits. And Rowena said, oh yeah, and we saw some pigs. And Alice said, little pink pigs? And Rowena said, no, they were sitting in a police car. So, it was affecting the children, because the whole community, in a sense, even if you weren't working underground, the community was suffering the fallout. Local shops, their takings were down. People weren't buying so much and spending so much. But, it had been a lean time anyway, with as one friend said it, Mickey Mouse jobs in Mickey Mouse factories. There wasn't proper training. There wasn't any opportunity or hope for the future. It was all about keeping people in their place. And I think really people lost heart. I know several of my relatives did. They couldn't see a way out because you couldn't get opportunity if you didn't have the educational sort of abilities of going to university and escaping. The only well-paid jobs were the colonies. And that's what we were afraid of losing. So that's how the people in the community met people from LGSM, first of all, was the people who were hosting them, were taking them out to meet their families and to meet their friends and taking them to their local pubs. So although the Onllwyn would be a focus, really they were experiencing life in different parts of the community then. Things like beautiful little bits in the film, about teaching people to play bingo and going to the local butchers and faggots being on display and saying, do you think we should have that word up there? Well, and explaining that a faggot in our community was sort of like a meat risol. And don't say anything to her outside, like, I'll explain. So, it was about two communities that collided, but really got on very well together.
And as miners took LGSM members into their homes, so LGSM members hosted miners and their families with them in London.
So we had 4 visits, I think, when we went to Wales, and maybe 3 when they came down to see us in London. Yeah, the miners that came, and they're always delighted to be in London because it's London. It's a big, it's a big bad city, So they used to love coming down and staying with us. The first visit they paid to us, we took them to the Tower of London, but not inside it, because bear in mind, we were all quite young. They were on strike, so they had no money. So we couldn't afford to go inside the Tower of London. But, you can walk around the outside of it and you see Tower Bridge and the river, and it's all iconic stuff. And we were out with Di Donovan's then wife, Margaret Donovan, and their 2 children, Owain and Llynos. And Owain was 4 years old, and he saw a beefeater, and he he put his hands on his hips and went up and challenged this beefeater and said, "You're a scabby piggy, you are. You're a scabby piggy. You want to lock my daddy up?" And Margaret Donovan had to lean forward and drag him back again and said, "Oh, I need a beefeater, not a policeman."
Did we ever visit London? Couldn't keep us away from there. Because now we weren't going to London to stay with strangers. We were going to stay with friends. First thing would happen when we turned up there was the Dad would pile the kids into the car, and then he'd drive them down to Nine Elms Tesco and let them pick anything they wanted in the trolley. And I would say, for God's sake, don't do that, because they'll pick really expensive things, and they'll pick things that I don't allow them to have, like sugar puffs and chocolate spread and crap. And Derek would say, shh, let them do it. So that the result would be that they'd be bouncing off the ceilings, with all this sugar. But that meant that we met their families and their partners and their friends. And when we get to Roy and Duncan's flat, they had this most amazing bath. this really deep bath. I remember now the children were only by this time 8 and 5, and the first thing they would do when they would get to tokens is fill the bath with water, get in and have a bath, because this bath was ginormous. And it was so deep, and there was so much water. They literally thought it was like a swimming pool. You know, they'd have a great old time in this old council flat in City Road. So they were part of other people's families. And one of the nicest things Derek ever said to me is, thank you for letting me be part of a family. You know, because through your children, I've been part of a family. You know, and people like Mark Ashton, you know, I've got cards and letters from Mark when he was abroad and sending little messages for the children. And I remember having a postcard from him from New York, and he said, tell the kids I wouldn't say that New York was manic, but even the cats are on skateboards. Yeah. So we were being exposed to their lifestyles, but they were being invited into our homes and experiencing family life. And I think the big point really for us was when we went to a club one night with friends and it said no breeders allowed. And we didn't understand what that meant because, you know, being taken out clubbing was like, wow, you know. And there was this sign up which said no breeders allowed. And I said, guessing, what's that mean? That's what, you know, we call heterosexual couples. Get said, I don't want to go in there if I can't take you and Martin in there, you know. Come on, let's go. And after that, Gethin said, I don't really want to go to clubs where I can't take all of my friends. That's the other side of the coin, isn't it? Because suddenly we were seeing the differences, and I remember us being at a party. It was Nigel, Jonathan's partner's 40th birthday party, and somebody turned up in full BDSM costume. And all the women huddled into a corner, and you know, all the lesbians and all the women of the delight. It was no, we're not putting up with this. We have to go put some trousers on. You know, can't behave themselves. But you know, it's that clash of cultures really, because one of the things that I was particularly shocked by was cannabis. You know, I can actually say as a politician, I've never inhaled it. And that caused lots of jokes that I was quite puritanical about drugs and things like that. And there were funny little things like going along to Derek's and me having to march downstairs and say to him, right, you can get those plants out of that bath now. And then there was going to Nigel's 40th birthday and me being presented with the first slice of cake. I'm thinking, why am I being presented with the first slice of cake? This is a singular honour. And everybody just looking at me and waiting for me to take this slice of cake. And you know that moment, you know. And Jonathan's always said, you know, that he puts his longevity down to his use of cannabis, and you know, and I was always lecturing him on. So there were all these little stories and little, you know, things that were, you know. But what we learned was that our friends were socialists like us. They were activists. They were fighting against the repressive Tory government under Margaret Thatcher. And, you know, those are the things that mattered, not our sexuality, not where we were from. It was that which made us similar that was important.
That's the end of part 2. In part 3, we look at how the group developed, what happened when the strike ended, and how LGSM and the Welsh miners played such a big role in changing the country. Our Patreon supporters can listen to this now, as well as bonus audio. For everyone else, it'll be out next week. You can support us on Patreon, get early access to episodes and more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. In this week's bonus episode, we hear more from Mike about the history of the mining communities in the Welsh valleys, and Mike gives some more detail on exactly how LGSM organised, which also helped its history be preserved today. We think it's really interesting, but we are nerdy about that kind of stuff, so we recognise that level of detail might not be for everyone. To all of our current patrons, we'd like to send you a heartfelt thanks for your generous support, which makes this podcast possible. As always, we've got more info, further reading, photos and videos about LGSM on our website, workingclasshistory.com, and linked to in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. The music for this episode is by the Kellingley Colliery Brass Band. Catch you next time.